What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Banishers, Ghosts of New Eden, a game that takes place in colonial America, specifically 1695, or at least an alternative history version, where we take on the role of two ghost hunters. But before we dive too deeply into that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video that will explain everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. In the case of this game, you might just notice that this review is going up a day before the game officially launches on February 13th, and that is because I got a review copy in advance from the publisher, Focus Home Interactive, and I've had the game in my hands for about a week. With that in mind, 100% on this title is not terribly difficult, as it has a pretty handy map completion number associated with the map itself alongside locations where you can typically find things. So as 100% go, it's a pretty straightforward one. And then finally, before we dive into this fully, with this game not even having officially launched yet, I'm going to be avoiding spoilers where possible, but I will be talking about the story setup and things that were known via the marketing. However, there might still be some contextual stuff in the footage, or if you want to go in completely blind, you might consider simply skipping the story section in particular, as this video will be timestamped. And with that out of the way, let's start talking about this game. So what is Banishers Ghosts of New Eden? Well, this is an action-adventure with a big emphasis on its story and the consequences of the choices you'll be making. We take on the role of Red and Antea, who are known as Banishers, or people that combat ghosts, because in this world, ghosts are very real. They attach themselves to human beings and leech their life force until they are driven crazy and die. Banishers step in to, of course, prevent that from happening, typically by sending the ghost off to whatever fate awaits them. So this is a game that is going to see us oscillating between getting to the bottom of various hauntings and dealing with the mysteries therein, to also fighting off all sorts of ghosts in action-oriented combat that, for the most part, I think advances what this developer, don't nod, began with Vampire, which hopefully I'll make clear over the course of this review. First up though, let's talk about the technical state of the game. How is this thing running? As that is always a point of contention with new titles these days, and with that in mind, I am playing on PC, and a very high-end one at that. So, while I did run into a few small issues, it's worth noting that how this ran for me isn't necessarily how it's going to run for someone else, and because this is pre-release, I don't have anything else to compare it to. But as far as the technical side of things go, I ran into basically zero issues, with everything being very minor. I did not have any crashes, no major bugs, etc. I did run into some minor issues, in particular a little bit of stuttering when I could tell the game was loading, so some FPS dips here and there, and then the occasional wonky animation, especially on mouse and keyboard. When I was playing on the Steam Deck with controller support, it didn't pop up as much, but with a mouse and keyboard, I often noticed that if I was moving the camera really quickly, etc., it would actually mess up the run animation and he'd suddenly be running sideways or something. And then once or twice I would get stuck on terrain for just a few moments before the game seemed to sort itself out. So as far as the technical side of things go, that was about the extent of the issues I ran into, and this game does offer a handful of helpful features actually. It starts off by letting you customize various accessibility options like subtitles, contrast on those subtitles to help you see and visualize what's going on screen. There's a UI scaler. So technically speaking, I found this game to be in a pretty good place. Which brings us to our next topic, being difficulty. This game features 5 difficulty modes, from story to very hard, which, as you can see, modifies damage, health points, the amount of healing items you recover in between combat encounters, as well as exploration puzzles. Now, on the puzzle side of things, this means that certain exploration puzzles have you do a few actions in a set amount of time, and the difficulty determines how much time you have to do that, such as shooting multiple targets in quick succession. However, there is zero penalty for changing the difficulty at any point, as I would argue the bigger emphasis is on story, and while combat is certainly a good chunk of this game, it's pretty clear they wanted you to be able to customize the experience to your liking, so there's plenty of difficulty options to play around with. I think the only thing I'd add to this, if it were an option, would simply be to let you customize the difficulty, that is to say, give you modular options to play around with, as for instance being able to adjust the specific timing of just the exploration puzzles is something I think would have been helpful for people, but it's not bad. Now that brings us to the story setup setup section and my thoughts on it. Again, I won't be covering spoilers in depth, but if you don't want to hear this part, certainly skip ahead. Otherwise, you've been warned. So, like I mentioned earlier, this game follows the story of Red and Antea, two banishers, as it were, people who hunt ghosts essentially, because they attach themselves to people, leeching their essence, driving them mad before eventually killing them. Our job is to sort that out and send them to whatever afterlife awaits them. Red and Antea are lovers, and they are called to a place called New Eden, a colony in 1695 colonial America near Boston, to help out their friend with a very prominent haunting of sorts that he needs help with. It quickly becomes apparent, however, that this is no mere haunting, and having gotten a little bit ahead of themselves, Antea dies. However, the nature of her death and the unfinished business leads her to rise as a ghost attached to none other than Red, which puts them in an awkward position, being banishers of ghosts and all. But to complicate it further, in order to save Antea, you need to recover her body, so you can help her out one way or the other. Before you can do that, however, in order to keep Antea from leeching essence from you, you need to solve haunting cases and deal with other ghosts so she can take essence from those situations, which just so happens to form a type of progression at the same time. And that's where we get to the crux of the game. The story is largely built up around making significant decisions surrounding both the larger case, which is called the Nightmare, and several smaller haunting cases that make up side quests. And these form the, I would say, major and minor choices of the game. After every haunting, you're going to be able to decide what to do about the situation. That is to say, ascend or banish the ghost involved. That is to say, let them pass peacefully into the afterlife or banish them to oblivion. Or you can blame the living person and kill them. And what you choose to do here makes up the endings of the game. That is to say, will Antea successfully pass on to the afterlife? Or will you perform a dark ritual to bring her back from the dead, which requires you to kill a lot of people. And to take it one step farther, earlier in the game, they have your character swear an oath one way or another. And your choice to either stick to or abandon that oath even further complicates the waters a little bit. So in addition to making all those choices, the relationship between Antea and Red is tested by these decisions, which makes up the bulk of the story. Now that's about as much as I want to say without outright spoiling anything. So the thoughts portion of this, I enjoyed that quite a bit. I think they did a good job with this for the most part. I think the relationship between Red and Antea was done pretty well. Most of the dialogue between them is meaningful and relevant, though there are certainly times in combat especially where phrases get repeated, and I wish I had something to turn off that extra chatter with, but the relationship of having them both on screen didn't feel intrusive, as you can switch back and forth between the two as well, so she also plays a big role in combat. So it didn't really ever feel like a voice in your head situation, but rather it felt like you were playing two distinct characters. Another thing I really like about the story of this game and how it's told is that rather than simply give you the big decisions and you move on, for both the major decisions that you'll make and the minor ones, you actually get follow-up quests to see how things panned out and what the outcome of those decisions is. You'll get like a follow-up side quest specifically about that situation that shows you what happened. And I was a real big fan of that, to show you, again, just the consequences of the choices you have made. And beyond just making the decision, it will also have substantial impacts on both the environment in some cases, that is to say certain towns that you'll be running into, in addition to just things like narrative choice. With that in mind, if you are just going for the main story, it's likely going to run you around the 20-hour mark, but if you try to do everything, I would say a full 100% map clear is probably going to be more like 40 or 50 hours, as there is a lot of side content. With that said though, I really enjoyed the story. It had some great moments. I was interested in the world. I think the story is well told. They handled choice and consequence exceptionally well, and combined with the game's atmosphere, I think they did a fantastic job. My only real complaint about it, and something you'll hear me echo with the side content, is that I wish some of the investigations into the hauntings were just that, more of an investigation, rather than you being led around by the nose, basically. And for the main story, I think it makes a little more sense, but especially for the side content, I do wish they had put a little more emphasis on the process of the learning about ghosts, etc., which we'll get to, instead of just the indecision. For now, let's talk progression systems. So this is an RPG after all, and as we play through the game, fight off various ghosts, complete side quests, etc., we will be gaining experience. We'll also be picking up abilities as we go, finding all sorts of new gear, which can then be upgraded. So let's talk about that. Now, leveling up is pretty straightforward. You gain experience, you level up. When you level up, you'll be given a skill point for red, and when you solve haunting cases, you'll be given essence, which upgrades Antea. Their skill trees are bound together and somewhat limited by story progression. As you complete the main chapters of the main story, you'll unlock big abilities called manifestations for Antea. These allow you to traverse the world in new ways, but also have a bunch of skill trees associated with them, which is what you'll be spending those ability points on. And they are interconnected between Antea and red, so blue and red here. Sometimes you might have to spend an Antea point before you can get to the part of the tree that allows you to spend red points, etc. In addition to that, every one of these is a decision. It's an either-or choice. You won't get every single node here, but rather when you mouse over them, you can see the one next to it that gets highlighted, and you're choosing between those two abilities for that character. And this is going to let you hone in on all sorts of individual abilities and focus on the part of combat you like the most. Another big part of this is gear. There are 8 pieces of gear you can have equipped total, 4 for Antea and 4 for red. Each piece of gear has stats associated with it as well as a big passive ability. So this is where you might want to, again, swap things in and out to focus on the aspect of combat you like the most, as you can definitely make certain builds, which, while not really important for like normal and below, does become more of a thing on the higher difficulties. And just in case you were wondering, changing out your main clothing gear does actually change red's appearance, so finding things will customize how you look throughout the game. And this gear can be upgraded. As you move through the game world, you'll find all sorts of minerals and plants alongside ghostly crafting reagents that you can then spend on upgrading this gear up to a maximum rank of 7 or relic. So depending on the difficulty, there's as much or as little of managing this as you would probably like. And while it's not a wildly deep system or anything, it's better than nothing. And then last but not least, the environmental abilities. So these double both between the environment and actual combat. As you complete main story chapters, you'll unlock abilities for Antea, like I mentioned, called manifestations. These are important because they will open up new pathways in the semi-open world for us, sort of Metroidvania style, if you will, allowing you to retread old ground and find new things, as they open up various ways of traversal. However, they also can be used in combat to devastating effect if you sort of spec into them, as you'll earn things that allow you to do a sort of charge attack, a big AoE burst, a freeze, and later even a big sort of super fusion thing. So progression-wise, things are relatively simple, but I think there's enough there to keep you engaged at least. And I will say, if you are doing everything, that is to say actually trying to clear the map, etc., you are going to wind up with an overabundance of materials, as all of it respawns even. And it's pretty easy to get your hands on, so really the only limiting factor in terms of upgrading new sets of equipment is you and whether or not you want to do it. But that brings us to the gameplay and world section. Now, from a more mechanical standpoint, I would call this semi-open world. Technically, you are in one big contiguous area that you can move from one end of the map to the other on, but it does that sort of corridor pathway sort of system where, despite these areas being connected, it does kind of feel like a lot of set paths, if you will. So I wouldn't call it open world myself, especially since it kind of sees you moving through gaps and crawling under things that are clearly just loading screens hidden behind game mechanics. But the cool thing is, unless you fast travel, there is no loading screen, and the game world is divided up into several different areas which make up, I would say, the main chapters of the game. For each of these individual sections, the game has a map completion rate as well, so if you're looking for specific things, you can actually track down to specifically where it should be, at least in terms of what section of the map. And the game features a fast travel system at the campfires you'll find, which makes it nice and easy to get around. Which is important because you'll be jumping around certain areas, especially for the side quests, quite a bit. And exploring that world is down to basically the environmental stuff that I've already mentioned, interspersed with, of course, the occasional fight with spirits from the hauntings. And while you will certainly be inundated with hostile spirits and ghosts, there are, however, 3 sort of fully fledged towns where you can go stock up on supplies. It's where you'll deal with a lot of the hauntings, of course. And I think they did a good job of making each of these areas feel different as well, which brings me to the more, I would say, subjective portion of the gameplay and world, and that is to say how it felt. I love this game's atmosphere. I think they really did a fantastic job with making the world kind of feel oppressive but wild at the same time. It kind of feels like you're traipsing through frontier areas much of the time. There are paths, but they're not particularly well carved out in a lot of cases. Everything outside of the towns where people have taken refuge, and barely that in some cases, feels hostile. There are spirits everywhere, spurred on by the larger nightmare at play, which I was really happy to see because the thing that actually initially drew me to this game was the atmosphere. I just thought it looked incredibly cool, and that part of the game absolutely delivered. But let's talk about some of the content you'll be getting up to as part of the gameplay. Now, a lot of this takes place as side quests, or haunting cases as they're called, where you'll be getting to the bottom of hauntings for just about every citizen you'll run into, really. Now, I liked a lot of what they did here, but I do think it has one major flaw. What I liked about it was that it showcased a lot of, I would say, different ways Banishers interact with people, as this is a time where accusations of witchcraft were a very real thing, and the game certainly plays around with that, but Banishers are seen as a sort of necessary evil, because what they do needs to be done, otherwise people will die, so they are somewhat tolerated. In fact, the game even mentions you can usually find at least a few of them traveling with every single army, as the death involved tends to draw ghosts. And it also highlights exactly how Banishers do what they do, which typically involves getting to the bottom of why the ghost is there, what is tying them to the world, both the person they are attached to and a physical item in many cases that is related to them somehow, that can then be used in a ritual to force them to leave. And the game does a great job of going through all of the variations you might think of, ways that might play out, including some ones that I thought were especially interesting. And then at the end of those, you have the choice to either kill a settler outright and sort of blame them for the haunting, get rid of the ghost in a more forceful manner. There's even a few with some more interesting choices. And while I like the bulk of what they were trying to do, there is one thing that really stood out to me, and that is that you never feel like you're actually investigating these cases, because you're kind of not. It does have this UI thing where you can find out like hints of what's happening and why things are the way they are, but you're ultimately being led around by the nose for each of these side quests, being directed to exactly where you need to be, finding all the evidence, and then once you've gathered all that, you'll make a very informed decision about how you want the situation to conclude. And I wish personally that they had just focused a little more on the investigation side of it, allowed you to, say, miss things or not necessarily have all the information when you make a decision, because I think that little bit of extra interactivity, if you will, would have really pushed a lot of these over the edge into the territory of great, because as it stands, I just enjoyed them, but I think they could have been a little better. Though, as I mentioned, just like with all the main story ones, depending on what you do for each of these situations, you will get a follow-up side quest afterwards if you want to see what happened to that situation based on what you decided to do. And in the case of dealing with merchants, there are even more, I would say, tangible rewards, as merchants will either like or dislike you based on the decisions in their side quests, which can lead to better or reduced prices. Also, a little more directly, blaming someone kills them, which obviously means they're not in the game world anymore, usually. Now, beyond just that, there are a handful of other activities you can get up to that usually involve exploring the world in some way. You can find some more elaborate exploration puzzles called haunting grounds. You can find cursed chests that you can then find ways to uncurse, which usually involves the ritual system, which I haven't mentioned up to this point because it's super simple, but there's 5 rituals you can perform, usually to either summon a ghost, force an echo to reveal itself, or do things like remove curses from objects. So there's a good bit of exploration-based gameplay that can lead you to all sorts of extra rewards, should you want to bother. You can even find a reference to Vampire if you're sharp enough. Now, all of that brings us to the combat. Right away, I will say that I don't think combat's bad, but I do think it's the weakest part of the game. I think it's a step up from Vampire, which also had pretty janky combat, but I'd be lying if I said I was immensely satisfied with it or anything like that. I don't think it's bad, like I mentioned, but I think issues with things like the exact timing on dodges, the sort of flailing that you'll be doing a lot of the time, and the kind of drip feed of abilities that get given to you, such as the fact that you don't have a rifle for a good bit of the beginning of the game, leads to a combat system where I was usually just trying to get it over with rather than having fun with it. Now, probably the first thing is the sort of drip feed. Later on, once you get all of your abilities and items and everything going, I think combat can get enjoyable, but that takes a really long time. For instance, you don't get Antea's sort of special ability that Red gets from the start of the game until almost the end of it. Ultimately, Unfortunately though, combat is going to see you switching between Antea and Red pretty regularly, as Antea can see into the spirit world, which is useful for fighting possessed enemies, and also environmental exploration of course, but she deals extra damage to enemies that are possessing corpses and things like that, which will see you fighting skeletons. And then Red usually does extra damage to actual specters and things who aren't inside or possessing something currently. You have your standard light and heavy attack. Both Red and Antea's version of this is a little different. Antea has her manifestations she can use in combat, which will have various effects. Red gets his rifle, of course, which can hit weak spots. Once he's hit enemies enough, he will restore the spirit points for Antea, because Red, while having a life bar, that's depletion, leads to you dying, Antea has spirit points. Once this gauge is empty, you simply switch back to Red, but when Red attacks things, he fills both his banish and the spirit points bar. So switching to Antea can be a great way to avoid taking damage to your health directly in certain situations, but the Banish bar allows you to do a big sort of special move from Red that deals massive damage to an enemy ghost, and while it won't always kill them, certainly is capable of doing so. There's also a block and parry system, but you don't really have to mess around with that too much if you don't want to, but that's pretty much everything in terms of how it works. Now, in execution, you'll find that mostly you want to be switching back and forth between Red and Antea at appropriate moments, fighting off enemies, based on what you're fighting, what's going to deal the most damage, how to avoid incoming damage, the usual stuff for an action adventure, really. However, another point of criticism, beyond it just not being my cup of tea, is that, as you might have noticed on screen, enemy variety is pretty low. There's only a couple different spirit types and only a couple of different corpse types. Now, what they tried to do here was make the most of their limited variety by allowing different types of spirits to possess individual types of corpses. Corpses, or the skeletons you'll be fighting, will have weapons and moves associated with them that are then augmented by whatever spirit is possessing them. So there's a little bit of a mix-match system here where exactly what kind of abilities a individually possessed skeleton might have will actually change. But it's just not enough. You're going to be fighting the same types of enemies for most of the game, and while I thought a lot of the boss fights were really cool and cinematic, the actual feel of the combat and the systems never quite landed for me, and while, again, it's a big step up from Vampire in my opinion, it wasn't a super satisfying experience. So make of that what you will. All of that, though, does bring me to the Steam Deck section, and I'm happy to say that this ran substantially better on the Steam Deck than I was expecting it to, frankly. Now, it has the usual stuff, controller support, as this is launching on both PS5 and Xbox X and S as well, so the controller support is no surprise. It also has cloud saves, the UI scaling helps with the size and visuals of everything, and while I did have to knock down everything to low settings, which the game will do for you by default, it did actually feel pretty good on the Steam Deck at those settings. Everything was pretty smooth, it didn't really have any issues with load times, and while it certainly doesn't necessarily look as good as it will on PC or even console to be sure, it did feel and play very, very well. So while the game is currently unrated on the Steam Deck, I would be shocked if this got anything besides a full verified rating, with the only real note about the Steam Deck specifically being that some of the default controller mapping is just like a little bit weird in my opinion, like exactly what button you have to hit to attack versus shoot with your rifle is for some reason different, and it's not a huge deal, it just takes a little getting used to. But otherwise, great experience. That, though, brings me to my positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, the story and the atmosphere. I loved the story, I loved the atmosphere. The choice and consequence followed up by seeing exactly what happened to individual cases you dealt with, as well as the bigger outcomes for individual settlements, and the characters involved, all of which leads you to a few different endings you can check out, all while navigating this just incredibly lush and dense atmosphere that feels appropriately sickly and overwhelming at times, was just fantastic. I loved that part of this game. On the negative side of things, though, unfortunately, for me it was the combat. I just never quite got into it. I think it takes too long to get good, and even when it gets good, it's limited by limited enemy types, and I think the investigations would have felt better if they were actually investigations, as opposed to simply being pointed to exactly where to go and get all the information every single time. And all of that brings me to my conclusion for this one. Overall, I would say Banishers Ghosts of New Eden is a big step up from Vampire. I already enjoyed Vampire quite a bit, and with this game I can safely say that I've really been enjoying what don't Nod has been trying to do with its games, this is definitely one of my favorite action adventures out there now. I think the only thing holding me back from calling this a really amazing experience was the combat more than anything. I think it still feels a little janky, the timing's a little bit off, none of it has any weight, limited enemies like I said, and while for me I think the rest of the game is more than enough to make up for that and make it a really great experience, I do still wish the combat was better. But as it stands, I still immensely enjoyed it. So as for a recommendation, I don't know how much this is launching for. None of the information they gave me included a price, so as long as it's not anything outrageous, I think it's definitely worth a buy. So right around the $50, $60 range is what I would happily pay for it. 70's pushing it, especially for the runtime. But overall, I enjoyed my time with it. I think it's worth checking out. So if you're on the fence about it, it gets a buy from me. With all of that said, that's going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to let me know what you think about this title down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.